This isn't a case of someone please call security. It's a case of someone please call the risk committee. Some of these organizations don't have risk committees.
You can't just code your way out of some of this as well. The trust in the technology and the ability for the technology to mitigate some risks, for example, through decentralization, is definitely there. But you still have to make the right decisions.
Welcome to Money Never Sleeps. Sharp riffs, big ideas, and real insights from smart people. I'm Pete Townsend, GP at Norio Ventures. Let's go.
Money never sleeps, pal.
So my guest today is Amor Sexton, Chief Operating Officer at Blockdaemon. She was last on the show in October of 2022, way back on episode 193. And we were talking about how institutional client expectations of resilient processes were going to drive blockchain adoption. Amor, welcome back to Money Never Sleeps.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Wonderful. So, in the last few weeks, Amor, you're familiar with Drift and Kelp, DeFi protocols, platforms that lost $577 million between them. Neither one of them was down to a code exploit. They were actually operational and governance failures. How does it feel to be 3.5 years early on the exact thesis the industry just got an extremely expensive lesson on?
Yeah, to be honest, not great. I don't think it feels good when you're predicting a situation where anyone suffers loss. I'd much rather be able to predict the price of crypto. that would be something I'd be more proud of. But, again, I think it's something that is underplayed as an industry. I said it 3.5 years ago, and I'm still saying it now. As an industry, we don't talk enough about risk management. We spend a lot of time talking about compliance, but risk is really, and the ability to calculate risk is really what determines capital investment into an economy. And, I was telling you earlier before we started, I remembered I'd read this book, Against the Gods by Peter Bernstein. And he argues that the ability to actually recognize that the future is not just a whim of the gods. In ancient times, economic catastrophic loss was just divine will or misfortune. But once people actually understood that you could calculate risk, you could calculate probability, you could model it, you could price uncertainty in, all of a sudden it changed the way that economies worked, and it brought about the modern economy. Everything from insurance against risk, the ability to hedge it and transfer it. If markets can't calculate and mitigate risk, they won't grow. And I think that's, again, coming back to this concept that governance and risk management is so important for institutional adoption in whether it's DeFi or just crypto more broadly. I think taking some lessons and looking back at how the concept of risk mitigation has evolved will be really helpful for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't a case of someone please call security. It's a case of someone please call the risk committee. And some of these organizations don't have risk committees.
They don't. I think even just the concept of or the terminology in the nomenclature can be a little bit confusing in the industry. So people talk about compliance and they think that everything that you need to know, but compliance is a subset of risk. Managing a company and managing risks is so much bigger than that. It's about governance. So the decision-making architecture that you have to be able to manage risk. It's about technology risk. It's about product risk, market risk, counterparty risk, as we saw with the whole FTX incident as well. So I think we just need to mature the conversations in the industry and acknowledge that you can't just code your way out of some of this as well. The trust in the technology and the ability for the technology to mitigate some risks, for example, through decentralization, is definitely there. But you still have to make the right decisions. And we just need to mature the conversation as an industry, stop talking about compliance at every single panel that I get asked on, and talk a little bit more about how we bring some of the useful things that the TradFi industry has developed over the years into this new industry as well.
Definitely. When I had Alejandro Gutierrez, our friend, on the show a couple of weeks ago, we both landed on the same two words, and you're saying one of them governance, the other one is guardrails. What he suggested was that no institutional player managing even a quarter of that money, say 150 million, would have run with the operational framework that Drift or Kelp had. What is that gap?
again, it's not just about the technology in the Web3 layer. It's looking at the attack surface more broadly.
Yeah.
Also vulnerabilities, I guess, because it's not just about attack, although in these two instances it was. In both of these cases, what I found really interesting is that it was the Web2 or the human layer that was compromised, but then the compromise was of a very legitimate, specific Web3 feature in both cases. I think it's about recognition that making decisions beyond just the technology itself and looking at the people, the processes, and looking at it as an entire framework. I think that's the main difference that people need to make. You can't just rely on, you can't just rely on a governance forum through governance tokens. You actually have to have more of a process around it. And humans are the ones that make decisions at the end of the day, even when it comes to setting up technology. So looking at governance of humans and the role that humans play in the process, I think is really important. And for me, sometimes in this industry, there's such a focus on trusting the technology without the recognition that humans are the ones that are controlling the technology at the end of the day. And so do you actually have that culture in your company amongst your people as well? I think that's a really important part of risk management that's underplayed. It's not just ticking boxes.
Yeah, definitely. I was listening to the On the Brink podcast that Castle Island Ventures does yesterday. And last week they had on a guy called Pluto. And he's a veteran of DeFi, cross-chain systems. And he said this, to quote him: everything that TradFi has built in terms of the circuit breakers, we're just speedrunning, relearning those things in crypto. What does that actually look like for taking these 40, 50 years worth of TradFi operatives that are leaning on a security guided operating model to crypto natives who understand things like validator networks and cross-chain messaging? How do you get these people into a room talking to each other?
It's about making sure that the leadership of any initiative, whether it's a company or it's a DeFi initiative or a partnership, that you have both of those skill sets there. Because I think it's also about iteration. So for example, multi-party computation actually addresses specific risks that the TradFi industry has found different ways of addressing through more kind of operational processes and procedures. But multi-party computation actually delivers a technological solution to that. But then at the same time, as we saw with Drift, it doesn't bring the whole solution. You still need to have that governance framework around it. So I think it's about not just a once-off knowledge sharing type situation, but a genuine ongoing collaboration between two different types of experts with iterative learning, where everybody understands the value that each is bringing to the table. I think it's unfortunate that in DeFi, we've seen a number of breaches or a number of issues where it's happening, but I'm definitely seeing more security experts, more risk experts, more, even more dialogue coming into this space. I just think it's maybe to the point that Pluto makes, the industry is moving quicker than the dialogue is moving in the maturation of the governance framework.
There's enough of us in this industry now, Amor, as you know, that have one foot on each side of the river between TradFi and DeFi, and that these are the folks that can help. And it will take a good 6 months to really truly identify every hole.
But I think it comes down to culture again.
Yeah.
And a recognition that this is really important. Because, with the Kelp vulnerability, what's interesting about that it was a known vulnerability. From what I heard, it was actually posted, I think it was January 2025.
Okay.
So people knew what the exploit was, but still, I think it was something like 47% of operators chose that single configuration. So
Yep.
Again, in that situation, it wasn't that it was an unknown risk. It was a known risk, and people just chose either chose not to assess it and built the mitigation into their architecture, or just accepted it and moved forward and didn't think it was important enough to address. And it's not that the single DVN architecture is a bad one. I mean, it's legitimate in that it can bring some benefits, but for large flows, it wasn't the best architecture to choose. And it kind of doesn't make sense as well when you're talking about a technology that uses distributed consensus to bring security and resilience. So it wasn't really utilizing the technology to its full extent. But that's where I mean, like the culture amongst the people is so important, and that's what needs to change. So it's not just a knowledge transfer, but it actually needs to be a cultural shift.
Definitely. If you were running a DeFi protocol today, or if you're a LP about to deploy capital into one, what are the 2 or 3 governance questions that you should be asking that almost nobody is asking right now?
I don't know if almost nobody is asking them, but I definitely want to get an inventory of all decisions that can be made unilaterally by the protocol, and looking at their independent oversight structure. So not just do you have a governance token and how does that operate? Because I think those decisions are different to what we're talking about here, but really digging into the role of the humans, to my point earlier, the role of the humans who hold the keys, who controls the multi-sig thresholds. What is the accountability structure around all of them, and how have you assessed the risk that's inherent in that framework? So I think definitely looking at who can make decisions other than just the DAO structure, but actually who can make decisions. And I think that's really important to ask. And I'm not sure if enough questions are asked around that. Definitely, I think building on from that, do you have a process of having named individuals making decisions as well and signing off on the risk assessment? So that's, for example, we talked about the DBN architecture. That was either an actual decision that was made, or it was a choice not to make a decision and to just build the architecture without actually doing the risk assessment. That's a failure in the process, and you need to make sure that you're asking about these decisions and remembering that the decisions and the technology, as I mentioned earlier, are still humans at the end of the day. So, and especially digging in on, has anyone identified the single point of failure in the architecture as well, and really honing in on the governance process around that. And then I think the last one would come down to what I've said a few times about the culture of risk assessment in the company, not just an approach to tick the box exercises, but actually, do you have a strong culture of continuous monitoring, of vigilance, of building a framework that can withstand a sophisticated attacker that could take months to exploit your vulnerabilities? And I think that's probably the third one, really just understanding that it's about the culture. What I'm saying here is that culture of risk assessment, that existence of a holistic governance framework within this, the DeFi initiative, that will determine whether or not your concerns can be met, and how secure it is for capital investment.
It's amazing that with all of this technology, it comes back to people.
It does. It always does. I think it comes back to people. It comes back to culture, and it comes back to making sure that you're not just moving really fast and evolving the technology itself, but that you're evolving your structure from a company perspective as well.
Absolutely. Amor, this has been brilliant. It's exactly the conversation that the industry needs right now. Totally. Thank you so much for coming back onto the show. Always a pleasure riffing on these things with you.
Thanks. It's been great to be here.
And to all of you, thanks for watching and listening. And don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcast. It helps others to find the show, and it means a heck of a lot to me. Till next time, see ya.